Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
They bring him into court, and he looks like a decrepit and confused old man. I think some people thought, well, he's malingering. The day before, he was perfectly fine. He's fine when he's in control, but when he's not in control, he just completely loses it. We saw what the true Joe DeAngelo is really like.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Insiders.
If you're following us on Patreon, thank you. And there'll be an exclusive extra chat following the main episode. It's a story of criminal escalation like no other. In 1970s California, he started small, creeping through backyards, breaking into homes, stealing trinkets, women's underwear, anything that let him relive the home invasion. But that thrill wasn't enough. He moved north to Sacramento and broke into houses at night, tied up couples, and terrorized them for hours. He'd whisper threats behind his mask, call victims afterwards just to remind them he was still out there. Then he moved south, turning serial killer, the original Night Stalker. He murdered without any mercy, bludgeoning and shooting his way across California from 1979 to 1986. Detectives suspected multiple offenders. No one imagined that one man could leave such a trail of death and cruelty.
Then he vanished. Decades of silence, no trace. His crimes were so spread out, the scale so vast, that the story became something of an urban legend. Until 2018, when DNA exposed the truth. All those rapes, all those murders were revealed to be the work of one man, Joseph DeAngelo. A former cop, a father, a neighbour mowing his lawn in broad daylight, but who, by night, was one of the most sadistic predators in American history.
In our last episode, we spoke to former FBI profiler Julia Cowley about the detail of the Golden State Killer's crimes, his years-long reign of terror across California, his escalation from prowler and burglar to serial rapist and ultimately to murderer. In our second episode, we continue our conversation with Julia as she shares her full psychological profile of the man known finally as the Golden State Killer. We'll discuss the investigation, the arrest of Joe DeAngelo, and what Julia observed about his behaviour during court proceedings. We'll also explore what's been learnt since about DeAngelo's background, what may have shaped him, and how someone could descend into such depravity and violence. But before we talk to Julia, Martin, just remind us of the timeline of the Golden State Killer's crimes and also his eventual capture.
Joseph DeAngelo's crimes terrorised California for more than a decade. Between 1974 and 1986, this one man was responsible for at least 13 murders and dozens of rapes and burglaries across the state. He began as a burglar and peeping Tom in the mid-70s, ransacking homes in Visalia, then escalated to attacking women and later couples around Sacramento. By the early 80s, he was stalking and killing victims in Southern California. And then, after the murder of an 18-year-old girl in 1986, the attacks suddenly stopped. For decades, the identity of this violent predator remained a mystery. It wasn't until April 2018 that investigators finally unmasked the Golden State Killer using a revolutionary DNA technique. By building a family tree from DNA evidence, they identified a suspect and confirmed it with a direct DNA match, exposing the killer as 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer. After more than 40 years, an unassuming man who had blended into suburban life was revealed to be one of America's most prolific serial predators.
Well, we're joined again by former FBI profiler Julia Cowley to help us understand who DeAngelo really was. Julia, welcome back to True Criminals.
Thank you for having me back.
After analysing the burglaries, the sexual assaults and the murders, what was your profile that you came up with of the Golden State Killer?
Okay, so I'll list off some things that were my observations. His primary motivation was sexual and based upon fantasy. And I believed that the offender combated his feelings of inadequacy and ineffectuality through fantasies of possessing power, toughness, and the ability to intimidate others. And you see this demonstration of his fantasies and how he expresses himself through his crimes and related behaviors like his speaking through clenched teeth, making his gory threats, his brutal threats that he made toward the victims. He claimed his military affiliation. And so his exaggerated animalistic behavior, all of these things are contributing to his fantasy of wanting to appear much more tough than he really is. I felt he was very easily frustrated when he can't control his environment. And that was evidenced by the fact that when he lost control, he escalated directly to deadly force. And this was something that he did when he was met with noncompliance as well with female victims. He would escalate to violence by punching them. In one case, he put a nail file through the eye of a victim. But he didn't do this if the victims were compliant with him. Obviously, a self-centered individual, his needs came before anybody else's. These are behaviors people will notice about him, that he comes first, and his needs came before any of the victim's needs. And this is how he engages in his day-to-day life. I also felt that he lacked confidence in his ability to engage in physical combat with other males. He feels intimidated by, inferior to, and envious of other males. And this is why the males became victims. They were not just obstacles, they were crucial parts of his fantasy of feeling powerful. I thought he was likely to be socially awkward as well, because in his crimes, when he was under stress, victims described him talking to himself, mumbling to himself. Some of the victims thought there were two offenders there, like he was talking to somebody. And I thought this was a characteristic that would be evident to people that knew him. When he was under stress, he'd talk to himself and mumble. And I think when people do that, others judge them as being socially awkward. So I thought that would be the impression he left with people. He had an interest in the military. At the time, I didn't think he would have been in the military while committing his crimes, because in many of the cases, he claimed to be affiliated with the military. And I thought that based on the fact that he went to so much effort to hide his identity, why would he give them a piece of information that actually could lead to his identification? So I didn't believe that he was in the military. I also thought that he might have been too young to have ever been in the military, and that did turn out to be wrong, but I have a reason for that, of course. And I also felt that he was proficient with firearms and likely had formal firearms training. Now, what that could mean, I did believe at the time he probably had law enforcement experience. And it did turn out that he was a police officer at one time. But he was so proficient when he killed people with his firearms. And I thought that comes only from training. So that is my profile in a nutshell.
More than a nutshell, that's a very detailed analysis, Julia, understandably, of course.
Oh, it's way more detailed than that. It would take me an hour to read through my entire analysis, but those are the highlights.
Was any part of it contentious? And was there some, and I'm sure there was, some of it that your colleagues disagreed with?
Yes, and that's always the case. People are not always going to agree with everything because this is not an exact science, but I think the two areas that people disagreed with was linking the Visalia ransacking cases to the sexual assaults and the homicides. That was contentious because some people strongly believe they were not connected. The other thing that was a bit contentious was the fact that I had written that I believed he had law enforcement experience, and that was ultimately taken out of my written report, and I left it as he had formal firearms training. And that was my compromise because my superiors thought that I didn't have enough evidence to assert that. I felt I did. Verbally, I had provided that to the working group, and there were many of the investigators that also believed he had law enforcement experience just based on the way he committed his crimes and how effective he was.
That must have been fairly frustrating, I would have thought, for you to say that you thought perhaps he'd been a police officer and for that to be taken out when, in the end, that was in actual fact the case. How much of the profile that you just described to Martin and I turned out to be pretty accurate when you did eventually find out who he was and what his background, etc. was?
It was very accurate. And I'll tell you the one area where I was wrong. Well, when I discussed his military experience, I thought he would have been too young to have been in the military. So I didn't think he would have had any military experience. And that turned out not to be true. A profile can only be as good as the information that you have. And what I didn't know when I was analyzing these cases, there was a series of other burglaries that had occurred up closer to Sacramento. It was called the Cordova cat burglar. And I didn't know about those cases at the time. They were not something that law enforcement investigators had provided me. I didn't know they existed, but I know about them now, and many people believe he was responsible. So that would have put his starting age much younger. And so that might have changed it. Now, when I gave an age range, he fell within the age range, but in my opinion, I thought he was going to be older. So while he did fall within the age range, I thought he was going to be younger. So that's where I think the profile was not quite accurate. I was very confident that he had interest in the military, maybe even applied to the military. But again, I just thought he would have been too young to have actually served in the military. So I am not frustrated when somebody has a different opinion than me, because that's kind of the nature of criminal profiling. That's going to happen. So it didn't really bother me. I was insistent in keeping the fact that I thought he had formal firearms training. And it was, in my opinion, I don't want to say humorous, but well, where else are you going to get formal firearms training? I guess you could get it in the military, but I had already said I didn't think he was in the military during this time. So where else is he going to get it? So I felt like I got my point across, and I had verbally expressed that. So when you're prioritizing offenders or suspects, you would be looking for someone who might have had law enforcement experience.
You were right about him being a police officer.
Yes.
Many people I know join the police because it gives them, understandably, a lot of power over people, the power of arrest, the right to use a firearm, the right to kill people legally. Do you think that's why D'Angelo joined the police force?
Yes, I do. I think it's exactly why he joined. I don't think it's because he wanted to protect and serve. I think it was because of his insecurity, and it gives him all the power that you just described.
Yeah, and I guess all the knowledge about what police are looking for when they're hunting offenders, so a good idea of how to conceal his identity. Is it rare, Julia, that you do a profile and then it follows through with the offender being caught and you being able to match up your profile with the person who did it? I suppose what I'm getting at, Was there a lot of satisfaction in this case that after all that hard work you did, you were able to put it together eventually with Joe DeAngelo?
I don't know what the word is to describe it. Relief. Once I finished the profile, I felt in my heart, I don't know his name, but I feel very strongly that I understand this offender. I'm not in his mind, but as much as I could ever understand, I felt like I really had an understanding of him, and there was some kind of peace that came over that. I'm not searching for answers anymore. I'm not questioning what kind of person. I know what kind of person did this. And so when his name came up, my first thought was about investigators and how they might be feeling, because I don't have contact with the family members. I contact the investigators. So I was thinking of them and what it must be like to have that answer. And then just to see that he was what I thought he was. And he was nobody extraordinary by any means. As much as we want to elevate sometimes these serial offenders, I've never seen one I found extraordinary in any way.
There was a huge gap, Julia, between you drawing up your profile and his arrest. When did you learn that he'd finally been caught?
So one of the things is a misconception as a profiler. I'm a consultant. I'm not involved in the investigation, and I don't do arrests. I don't conduct investigations. So I found out through social media. I could tell there was some activity in the case. I was still an FBI agent. I was still employed. I knew some things were going on, but I wasn't part of that. And I was hearing some things. And so I thought, I think they're close to making an arrest. And then I learned through the media that an arrest had been made. And I waited a couple of days, and then I had an opportunity to talk to a couple of the investigators that I worked closely with. And obviously, my thoughts were with them and how they might be feeling and the overwhelming responsibility that they had on their shoulders to not only identify him, but now bring him to justice.
DeAngelo did ultimately end up accepting a plea deal and admitting to many of his crimes rather than it go to a full trial. What were your impressions of him, Julia, when he was finally brought out into the courtroom?
I thought that was the truest version of Joe DeAngelo that we would see. The day before he was arrested, he was out riding a motorcycle. He's perfectly fine. And then they bring him into court, and he looks like a decrepit and confused old man. And I think some people thought, well, he's malingering. And that's not what my impression was. My impression was that's what happens when all of his control is taken away. He completely implodes. And we saw this in his crimes that he committed. He cannot stand and cannot handle the way a normal person can to not have complete control over everything. So I thought that is the truest version of this offender, is when they wheeled him right in. That's him. And I was not surprised at all.
Can you describe what he looked like, Julia? And you mentioned wheeled in. I think he was in a wheelchair, wasn't he? Looking pretty frail.
Yes, he was looking old, decrepit, like he couldn't walk. He was confused. His mouth was gaping open. And the day before, he was perfectly fine. He was fit. Even when they finally put him in his jail cell at some point, he was doing calisthenics. He's fine when he's in control. But when he's not in control, he just completely loses it. And when investigators brought him in to be interviewed, he didn't say a word, and at one point they left, and he was mumbling to himself. All these characteristics that he displayed when things didn't go right in his crimes and what victims described. And this is what we saw. All his control had been removed from him, and we saw what the true Joe DeAngelo is really like.
Julia, you've explained that in your profile you didn't think he'd been in the military.
Yes.
But he had been. I just wondered, was there anything else about him when you finally realised who he was that wasn't consistent with your original profile?
I gave him an age range. And while it was correct I thought he was going to be younger because I was not aware that there was another series of burglaries that I now believe he was responsible for. So I believe that he started his criminal career in Visalia. So I thought he was younger. Technically, the profile was right, but I know what I was thinking, and I thought he wouldn't have been old enough to have been in the military, and he was.
What else did we learn about his background?
So he was married. He had 3 children, 3 daughters. He did have issues with neighbors who described him being in his backyard and mumbling and getting mad. And apparently one neighbor believed he might have killed their dog. So he was considered to be odd by some people, and people had issues with him. And I think some people would have described him as socially awkward. During the Visalia ransackings, he was a police officer. He then moved up to the Sacramento area where he was a police officer for a while. He was ultimately fired from that job because he was caught shoplifting, and then worked as a mechanic for most of his time until he retired. In my opinion, he seemed to be a pretty active, physically fit man, and we have no other crimes that we could link him to after 1986.
It's not unusual in the careers of serial killers to have gaps in their offending. And in his case, most notably, there was a 5-year gap between the murders of Cherie Domingo and Greg Sanchez and his final known victim, Janelle Cruz, in 1986. And then his attacks seemingly stopped. Do you know why he put an end to them?
I don't know specifically why. All I can do is surmise from other offenders that have discussed why they stopped. I think that during that gap from 82 to 86, where he didn't commit any crimes, he was starting to have children during that time. And I think he was getting older. He was slowing down in a way. And the crimes he committed required a lot of physical ability. It's also about the time where they were starting to use DNA in criminal cases. So I think all of these things contributed to him not having committed another similar crime, whether sexual assault or murder, after 1986. The idea that serial killers, they want to get caught is not true at all. So he did not want to get caught either. So it could be self-preservation. I think this combination of factors.
I think it was reported that detectives had left him alone in a room and he began talking to himself and insinuated someone named Jerry made him commit his crimes and that he, quotes, wasn't able to push him out. They compared this to that incident where he'd been caught shoplifting in the 70s. What did you make of that kind of behaviour?
When he's under stress, and this did happen when he was arrested for the shoplifting, he just lost it. He started screaming and mumbling. And so that just goes in line with the way he behaves when he's under extreme stress and when he feels that he doesn't have control of a situation. I don't know that I would consider what he said as any confessions, as opposed to maybe some sort of leakage or admissions of some sort.
Julia, the insights that you're giving us are absolutely incredible. Before we wrap, I just wondered that after studying someone as chilling as D'Angelo and seeing him finally caught for those horrendous crimes, are there any takeaways for our listeners, perhaps how people can protect themselves from predators like this?
I think these are the scariest type of predators because the victims themselves, there was nothing that I found within their collective victimology that would necessarily put them at risk for becoming a victim of this kind of crime. So they just happened to be somewhat in line with his victim selection or his preferable victims, but live in the area of his hunting grounds. And so to say there's anything any of the victims can do, that's very difficult. Even the cases where they may have left their doors unlocked, that's what I would say is make sure you lock your doors. But even in some cases, if he had a victim, investigators believed he might have gone into the home prior and unlocked a window somewhere. And who goes around their home every single night and checks every single window? We don't always do that. So that's the only takeaway I can see for investigators. When you start to see these home invasion type of crimes, rather than looking for an offender that has a sexual history or sexual crime in their criminal history, maybe look for people who have been caught for burglary or trespassing or peeping or loitering or things like that. Maybe look at those types of backgrounds, in addition, obviously, to someone who's committed sex crimes. But many of these types of offenders have started out as burglars. And go back and look and see if you can connect, were there burglaries leading up to this, and not just in your area, but surrounding areas as well. Can you connect them? So those are probably the two takeaways I have. It's really difficult with the victims because collectively they were low risk.
Julia, I just want to finally ask you a question about podcasts. Grim as the subject is, we really enjoy doing the True Criminals podcast. You and your former colleagues now host the Consult podcast. So I was just wondering, how's the podcast experience been for you?
Well, I enjoy doing the podcast because I enjoy working with my colleagues. I enjoy looking at the cases that we look at from a behavioral perspective. I really enjoy educating people about what criminal profiling is, taking a real look at what investigators go through. It has been a lot of fun in that regard. I've also learned that there are so many controversial cases, and if you don't agree with somebody's armchair detective theory, then they become very angry at you and lots of name calling and things like that. So that's been interesting to weather some of the controversy that's out there. I'm kind of used to it because I've had investigators that didn't agree with a profile and become very angry. So I'm used to that, but I didn't realize how controversial the true crime world can be.
Julia, thank you so much for joining us. I feel you've definitely educated us on criminal profiling, as well as given us a real insight into the crimes and dreadful acts of Joe DeAngelo and how you put that picture together when you were creating the profile of the man that eventually was called the Golden State Killer. Thank you very much for being on True Criminals. It's been a real pleasure, hasn't it?
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you for having me.
It's incredible and at the same time really unsettling to think how long it took for justice to catch up with Joseph DeAngelo. Decades of fear and trauma, entire communities haunted. And all that time, Martin, the killer was living an outwardly normal life, a former police officer, right among his unsuspecting neighbours and his family.
I can't think of a prolific serial killer here that went undetected for so long. And as Julia's profile showed, behind that normal facade was a man driven by a need for control and feelings of inadequacy. It turns out this notorious predator wasn't some criminal genius or deranged-looking monster. He was a small, bitter man who felt powerless in his own life and who got his gratification from exerting power over others. Through Julia's profile, we got a glimpse into the mind of a predator, not to excuse his actions, but to understand them. In the end, DeAngelo wasn't driven by some madness. He was driven by base urges, power, control, rage at his own failures, which he chose to act on in horrific ways.
The contrast is striking. Here's someone who's inflicted unspeakable terror, tying couples up, terrorising families. Yet when he finally faced consequences, he appeared as a feeble old man in a wheelchair, barely whispering. It was really quite incredible, I thought, to hear from Julia herself, who did that profile, Martin, and then to hear her describe what he was like in court, because sometimes, presumably, FBI profilers are doing profiles on people that are never caught. It must have been quite extraordinary for her to go full circle with this, bring that offender to life with all the clues, and then actually see him in real life.
Yeah, she was very vivid, wasn't she, about her description of D'Angelo in the courtroom. It was his final ploy for sympathy, perhaps, but one that failed. And after everything, he couldn't escape the truth. But, by then he was a lot older, and the most terrifying criminals do eventually become benign old men, and I've known a few of them.
Thanks to innovative police work, justice finally prevailed. It's worth noting that this was the first major cold case solved through genetic genealogy, that new DNA family matching technique. It was a groundbreaking moment for law enforcement. And it makes you wonder how many other hidden predators might eventually be unmasked by science and persistence.
Yes, the Golden State Killer investigation became a blueprint for using DNA to crack cold cases. And since D'Angelo's arrest, other suspects in long unsolved crimes have been identified the same way. Remember, Helen, we explored one British case in episode 38 of True Criminals. David Fuller, who committed the Tunbridge Wells bedsit murders in the 80s and was finally caught in 2020 through familial DNA techniques. We spoke to Ray Feisch. He was perhaps the first forensic scientist to explore family DNA. It's a reminder that no matter how much time passes, detectives never stopped working these cases.
D'Angelo will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the world now knows his name and his crimes. The survivors and victims' families finally heard him whisper a guilty plea. And as one prosecutor said, after 40 years of uncertainty, the man responsible for this reign of terror finally admitted it was him. It's a long time for justice to arrive, but it did arrive.
Yes, the Golden State Killer will go down as one of the most infamous serial criminals in American history. But he's also a case study in how determined investigators and evolving science can, not always, finally bring even the most elusive offender to justice.
Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Research for this episode was conducted by Becca Stinton. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.